Pues a ver, yo creo que en cuanto les veas sentados a estos, dar los buenos días y le dar la palabra a Alfredo, ¿no? Que es el primero.
Deberías quizás apagar el tuyo.
Sí, el mío está efectivamente.
Buenos días. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. Bienvenidos a este acto de apertura del Seminario Internacional Trends, Insights and Challenges in Social Psychology. Lo primero que voy a hacer es simplemente presentar a los que estamos aquí en esta mesa y les voy a ceder la palabra rápidamente porque el acto de apertura queremos que sea muy breve, muy rápido y que las charlas, las conferencias, pues comiencen cuanto antes. Mi nombre es Víctor Briones, soy el vicerrector de estudios de la Universidad Complutense, así que lo primero que hago es darles la bienvenida. Y me acompañan en esta mesa, a mi izquierda, don Alfredo Rodríguez Muñoz, que es coeditor jefe de la revista The Spanish Journal of Psychology, a quien le voy a ceder ahora mismo la palabra. Y a mi derecha, el dueño de esta casa, temporalmente, el decano de la Facultad de Psicología de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, Luis Enrique López Bascuas. Don Alfredo Muñoz tiene la palabra cuando quiera.
Gracias. Excelentísimas autoridades académicas, miembros de la comunidad universitaria, señores, amigas, amigos, welcome to the 9th International Spanish Journal of Psychology Seminar. We are really happy to taking up today this initiative. We have been, I think, 4 years without seminars for a reason that probably is familiar to all of you, COVID and the pandemic. Probably you heard about it. So this took a lot of limitations, but after 4 years, here we are again with this that is already a tradition in our faculty. First of all, this is possible thanks to the Faculty of Psychology of the Universidad Complutense de Madrid and el Colegio Oficial de la Psicología de Madrid. Thank you for making this possible, for the support to this kind of initiatives and to all the ideas that we have that they are always encouraging to make them possible. Obviously, we have to thank all the speakers for coming. I know that you have a busy agenda. It's complicated for all of you to spend 2 days in Madrid, but you were really enthusiastic about coming, and I have to thank you for being here. It's great to have you here in the Complutense. In addition, Mirko Antino, who is the co-editor-in-chief of the journal, and I would like to acknowledge the effort and the work of Ana Montero, who make this possible as well. She's the person behind everything and taking care of all the tiny details, so I want to thank publicly to Ana. And as Victor says, this is important to keep it brief, so I'm not going to talk longer, but the thing that I want to give you is a little bit of context of this seminar, okay? So the main idea is the crisis, well, it's supposed that we have a confident crisis in social psychology. I wouldn't say something specifically of social psychology, it's something beyond all the social sciences and some of the medical sciences as well. So we are in a moment of reflection and discussion. That is, the seminar is what for? To discuss and to reflect about our field and to see where are we going, what are the challenges that we have. In addition, I think that the seminar can shed some light to the social problems that we are facing nowadays and as a society we have to face. So I hope, although this is a really challenging goal, that we can have some knowledge for these kind of problems that we have. So basically, the main idea is this. The beginning of the seminar was this idea, and for this main idea, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. I don't know what this is not working now. Yes. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers who were really, really nice to accept our invitation. For understanding the impact and the relevance of our speakers, I'm just going to give you two numbers, okay? The first one is 2,500 papers, is the number of papers that they have written together. Number is 500,000. 500,000 is the number of citations that the papers have received. So beyond the numbers, which are important, but beyond the number is that they have a huge impact in our field. Basically, if you have studied social psychology, you heard about them. So now you have the opportunity to talk to them in person and to make questions. For this dynamic, a practical tip that I want to share with you for all who are online is that they can participate as well in the Q&A process through this application. They only have to log in with the hashtag I don't remember that, yeah, SJP seminar, and they will go directly to the seminar where they can make questions, and obviously you can do these same questions in person or through the application if you're a little bit shy. So I encourage you to participate in any way, okay? So
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Now we'll take some words, Luis Enrique López Vascuas as the Dean of this School of Psychology. Luis Enrique, cuando quieras.
Okay. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our faculty. Well, first of all, I would like to thank to our Vice Provost, Victor Briones, for being here today with us. It's always a pleasure to share some time with you, Victor. Thanks to the organizers, Alfredo Rodriguez and Mirko Antino, for arranging this wonderful seminar. Thanks to the Spanish Journal of Psychology and the Colegio Oficial de la Psicología de Madrid for being right behind everything, especially Ana Montero, thanks for everything. And special thanks to our invited speakers. Our organizers have gathered a group of outstanding researchers with whom I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to enjoy a very fruitful scientific interaction. And of course, welcome to all participants. The topic addressed in this seminar, trends, insights, and challenges in social psychology, could not be more appealing. For a humble experimental psychologist like me, most of the time worried with finding out in the lab how our mind represents very simple physical dimensions like frequency or intensity, to go out there, wandering through conspiracy theories, multicultural minds, jihadists, climate crisis, to name but a few, is both fascinating but also intimidating. But I guess we can feel safe since we are in expert hands. But, Alfredo talked about being in crisis and try to think about how to solve, foundational problems of the discipline. Let me just suggest some idea about this, humbly, of course. When I come to think about the gap that seems to exist between these two seemingly different domains of psychological inquiry, the most basic things and the applied things, or the more social things, I feel that there's a need to bridge the gap. After all, we're both interested in the human mind and in what human minds can do, sometimes in cooperation, some other times in competition with other minds. Thus, a sensible question is, to what extent is a human mind shaped by its interaction with other human minds? I guess that's precisely where social psychology comes into play, I guess. There have been a standard answer to this question that dates back at least to John Locke. Well, actually, we can go back to the Greeks, as usually, but let's take John Locke as a conspicuous figure of this theory. Locke wrote in his essay concerning human understanding this: "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be fairness? To this I answer with one word: from experience. Yes, from experience inter alia with other minds. So we are, according to this view, tanquam tabula rasa, blank slates, so to say. And as a matter of fact, the idea that human minds are blank slates has set the agenda for much of the social sciences and humanities, as reminds us Steven Pinker in his bestseller book, The Blank Slate. In particular, psychologists have sought to explain thoughts, feelings, behaviors with a few simple mechanisms of learning. Social scientists have sought to explain customs or social arrangements as a product of socialization of children by the surrounding culture. An even black slate model has served as an inspiration, as you probably are well aware, for political and ethical beliefs. So there you have a psychologist who believes that cognition saturates perception, or an anthropologist who believes that one's values are comprehensively determined by one's culture, or a philosopher of science who believes that one's observations are comprehensively determined by one's theories. Or even you might find a linguist that believes that one's metaphysics is, totally determined by one's syntax, as stated Jerry Fodor in the 80s. However, psychological research seems to cast doubt on these extreme relativistic views. After all, it might be the case that the slate is not that blank, and psychology is finding, out the structure of the mind, and this way there might be a hope for bridging the gap that I mentioned before. Maybe the task is to find how the structure of the mind interacts with the structure of the environment, including other minds, so that we can explain the complex behaviors that human beings exhibit and the complex ways in which human beings interact. And I'm pretty sure that this seminar will contribute to this kind of understanding. Now, I will translate to Spanish. Bienvenidos a todos y pasadlo lo mejor posible. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, dear Luis Enrique. Thank you, Dean. I think you forgot there is a simple veterinarian in the room. I got lost after the second phrase. Now, just a few words for you to welcome to our university. Dear Dean's office, dear colleagues, dear attendants, good morning, everyone. I will speak a little bit in English, then I will be even shorter in Spanish. For any reason I don't understand, I am convinced that you are not here to listen to my words. I don't know why, but it's a fact, it's a matter of fact. I'll be extremely brief. I want, first of all, to thank the Dean and his office, as well as the organizers, especially Mirko and Alfredo, for inviting me to this opening session of the 9th edition of the Advanced International Seminar organized by the Spanish Society of Psychology, which is entitled for this session, this edition, Trends, Insights, and Challenges in Social Psychology. I want also to convey my gratitude to the representatives of both this society, the Spanish Society of Psychology, and also to those from the Colegio Oficial de Psicólogos. But secondly, and most importantly, maybe, I wish to give also our warmest welcome to the Complutense University of Madrid and to this School of Psychology, to all the speakers, to all the attendants, to all the public which are together today with us to listen to your speaks, to your talks. Despite I do not know the speakers, I'm sorry. My skills lie in the fields of veterinary medicine and infectious diseases. You remember the bat, the pangolin, SARS, Ebola, these kind of things. I'm far away from my field right now. Some of your contributions sound very sound, even for an outsider. So I think you will get the contents of the reasons with the interest they deserve, and many of the attendants will provide you with interesting debates, discussions, and some enrichment environment. I think that from conspiracy theories to climate change links to psychology through multicultural minds, The scope is so wide and hopefully so deep that I hope anyone will find something of interest. If not, please let me know. Come to the rectorate, and I will provide you with some really passionate administrative task. It will be very easy for me to get you busy. I promise to be brief, so please enjoy the seminars, take from them as much as possible, make as many contributions in the debates as you can, share with your colleagues, and hope you all have a fruitful symposium. And always remember the etymology of the term symposium, those drinking together. Thank you very much, and our welcome. And now for them whose English is even worse than mine, just in Spanish, a few words. Bienvenidos a la Universidad Complutense. Espero que estas jornadas sean muy enriquecedoras. Participad en ellas porque, a pesar de que los intervinientes son muy brillantes, según nos han dicho algunos datos sobrecogedores, algunas cifras verdaderamente inalcanzables, lo importante en estas puestas en común es que los que no sois ponentes participéis, enriquezcáis el debate, planteéis cuestiones, planteéis preguntas y salgáis de aquí más enriquecidos de cómo entrasteis. Así que espero que así sea y que los 2 días sean muy fructíferos. Nada más, muchas gracias.
Pues ya está, ¿no? Pues empieza el trabajo, creo. Sí, creo que para trabajar. Así que nosotros os dejamos. Bueno, Alfredo.
Okay, I will try to make a brief introduction of each speaker's CV. Probably this is the most complicated part of all the organization of the symposium. So our first speaker is really well-known professor, so he needs no introduction. He's Richard Paley. Basically, as I was saying before, if you ever study social psychology, you know him, at least by the persuasion model with Cacioppo, the author, not the Asturian mill. So this freaky joke is obviously prepared. I tried to say some words about Richard. He wrote more than 400 articles and chapters. He had important impact in several models, like the one of persuasion that I mentioned, the flexible correction model, and the metacognitive processes in judgment model as well. He has received several awards and prizes that I don't have time to mention all of them. I just say, in general, he has received several of them. And today, he's going to be talking to us about attitude strength, what's new in the field. So welcome, Richard, and thanks for coming. Sí.
Possible to load.
Yeah, it's supposed Fran is going to change. Ya, pero
La tuya, hay que quitar la tuya. How about that? Is that better? First, welcome everyone this morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful symposium at this lovely university. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research we've been doing over the past many years on the concept of attitude strength. And so attitude strength, what is it? Well, we begin with the concept of attitudes. Attitudes are just our likes and our dislikes, what we think is good and bad. And perhaps attitudes are the most indispensable concept in social psychology. At least some people seem to think so many years ago. What does that mean, basically? Well, you're all familiar as social psychologists with a scale like this where we can rate something like mask wearing as good or bad, and people can differ in terms of what they think about that. But one of the problems long identified in the field is that not all of our attitudes predict our behavior. Some do and some don't. Some attitudes are very easy to change, some are very difficult to change. And this is where the concept of attitude strength comes in to the picture. So we can take somebody who thinks mask wearing is good, but some people might be very confident and sure of how accessible the attitude was, how important it was, how much you thought about it, whether it was ambivalent or not. And so all of these were well studied back in 1995. Since that time, since this talk is about what's new with what are the trends for the future in attitude strength, since then, a bunch of other different indicators of attitude strength have been identified. So for example, one very popular one is whether the attitude is based on your moral values or not, based on more practical things. And some of these, whether it's based on emotion. So emotional attitudes are more difficult to change than those that are purely cognitive. Okay, why do we care about attitude strength? As I mentioned, there are two things. Attitudes that are strong are more enduring, they're more difficult to change. And perhaps more importantly, they impact our behavior more. So we want to understand how all of this works. Both of those outcomes, first identified many years ago, tend to be true for all of the different ways we can assess attitude strength. So we'll try to look at that in a little more detail this morning. I'm going to try to present to you research on three new things, moving from research we've done longer ago to number two, very current research, to number three, research that is really just in its infancy in some ways, and that will be some of the unpublished work that I'll tell you about. Okay, first one, foundational. Let's think about how we used to think about attitude strength in the 90s and how we think about it today. So it used to be thought that there are different kinds of attitude strength indicators. And the classic view on this was a very influential paper that came out right after our book was published by John Basile, and he divided the attitude strength indicators at the time into two different categories in this JPSP paper. And so he said some of the indicators that have been identified he called structural or operative. There are things like how much have you thought about the attitude, how much knowledge do you have, is the attitude based on your emotions or your cognitions, and he considered these foundational or structural because they really were there. Right, so, and you could measure them with very objective kinds of things, like if you wanted to know how much thought someone has done, you could see how long a time they spent thinking about it. So that'd be a very objective. You could count the number of thoughts they had. You could measure the knowledge by saying, list all of the information you have about this topic and count it all up. So it was very much real underlying the attitude. And then he said there are these other things that he called meta strength or just simply perceived strength. And certainty would fall into that category, because you just ask people, how certain are you? You know, is anything really there? Or are they just making it up on the spot? You don't know if it's a structural thing. Or how important is your attitude? And people would just say, oh, it seems important to me. It's just sort of top of the head. So he said there's these two very different things, and maybe they do different things, and so forth. He thought the operative ones were like the real ones, and they should do the best job, and these other ones were not going to be as good. Okay, you could, sometimes they're divided into, these are the objective ones you could measure with objective indicators, and the other are more subjective. Okay, the newer view is that that's not quite right, that instead there are many attitude strength constructs, and so we'll have a column of constructs, and so under that column we're going to list all of the possible indicators. All right, so we'll take those ones that used to be thought to be fundamentally different, put them under the same category, and say, well, what we really have are two different conceptualizations of all of these different things. And so if you take something about like the amount of thought, which was thought to be the objective one, because you could measure the number of thoughts, you could say, well, you could measure that more subjectively and just ask somebody, how much did you think about this? So you turn it into a subjective one. Amount of knowledge, you could measure it all, or you could just say, how much knowledge do you have about this? A lot or a little? So there's nothing, you could turn each of those into both. The same is true for these ones that were thought to be purely subjective. So certainty, of course, you could ask somebody, how certain are you? Which is how it had been done. Or you could consider certainty a structural property. And so, for example, in some work we've done, we've said you could think of someone's attitude structure looking like this. Ice cream is very good. They're linked in the brain, right? So there's no disagreement about that. But maybe that certainty is also linked. It's good and I know it and I can retrieve that. There's nothing different about retrieving the certainty than there is about retrieving the attitude itself. So certainty could be a structural measure, and you could measure it by seeing how quickly they respond to certainty, how strongly it's associated with certainty using an IAT or something like that, right? So there's nothing inherent about the construct that says it's purely subjective as opposed to objective. Okay, so that's the newer way of thinking about these constructs. And so the old way would be that if perceived thinking enhanced attitude behavior consistency, it had to be because perceived thinking was linked to actual thinking, right? So it wasn't that the perceived ones couldn't work, but it was only because they were closely tied to the objective ones, and so they were measuring the same thing. The new view is that no, they don't even necessarily have to be correlated. Each of these is independently a potential moderator of attitude behavior consistency. And I just want to give you one example of a study we've done that sort of shows that. So in this case, we took some undergraduates at Ohio State. We gave them some arguments in favor of a new internet policy. And then we gave them a test, and we rigged the performance on that test so that their performance would either be very good or very bad. And the way we did this was giving them basically an easy test where virtually everyone did very well, or we gave them a nearly impossible test, right? So no matter how carefully you read that message, you would have a hard time answering these questions, right? And then we gave them totally accurate feedback about how they did on that test. And some got good feedback. Hey, you did great. Seems like you thought carefully about the message. Others were told, oh, you didn't do so well. Seems like you didn't really process that message very carefully. You didn't really think about it very much. And then we measured their attitudes, perceived thought, the certainty, and their behavioral intentions. Okay, so I just told you that's how we varied their perceptions of thinking. And so that manipulation, just two groups in this study, they got good feedback or bad feedback. That doesn't affect the attitude they developed from this message, so they both went along with the message. They thought it was pretty good, whether they got the good feedback or the bad feedback. But importantly, we were able to vary their perception of how much they thought they had thought about the message. Right? And in this case, we know, because this is a manipulation with random assignment, it's simply how much they think they thought about the message. There's no difference in the actual amount of thought. So we're trying to break that connection and see if the perceived measure can work independent of any connection to the real thing, because that's what people used to think. It would only work if it was connected to the real thing. So their perceived thought, the more they thought, the more certain they felt about their attitude. in the good feedback than the bad feedback condition. And then the critical thing was it did affect their behavioral intentions. And so when they got the good feedback, they said, I'm certain of this attitude, so I'm going to sign a petition in favor of this policy. I'm going to vote for this policy. So they did it just because they thought they had thought, not because they had actually thought about it. Okay, so just an example of a study showing the concept is there. It makes the same predictions, but they don't have to be linked to each other. Okay, the mere perceptions of thinking can increase attitude-behavior consistency without any actual differences. Since then, we've shown that mere perceptions of knowledge can do the same kind of thing. The mere perceptions of the moral basis of your attitude, if you just take a little quiz and you're told, oh, your attitude seems to be based on morality as opposed to practical considerations, you're more willing to act on that attitude because you think it's based on morality, not because it actually is. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail about any of these studies, but just want to give you sort of the bottom line so I can move on to some of the newer studies. So now that we have this new conceptualization, that there are two different ways of assessing these different strength concepts, people have begun to look at, well, how often are they correlated? And for some, they're pretty well correlated on average, and so how much knowledge you think you have is pretty well correlated with how much knowledge you can actually report on a free response scale. But for others, the correlation's pretty low, right? So how much your attitude is based on affect by using some objective measure of how much affect is associated with it and how well that predicts the attitude isn't very well correlated with responses to a question like, to what extent is your attitude based on emotion? People don't seem to have any good sense of that, right? They're just naturally not correlated. But yet they both predict stuff, right? Either measure, your perception predicts stuff, the actual predict stuff, and one of the interesting things is they can predict different things. And so there's a good number of studies now showing some of the different things that they can produce. They can also produce the same outcome, but for very different reasons, or because of different mechanisms. Okay, so those are the two things we keep in mind. Why do we want to measure all of these different constructs in these two different ways? Because they can predict different important consequences, and they can predict the same consequences sometimes for different reasons. And so we've done a couple of papers on this, and I'm not going to get into the detail, but wanted to just, if you're interested in that, there are other places where you can go and review papers and stuff. So this first principle of what's new is fairly well established and out there in the literature, so I'm going to leave it at that for the moment and move on to some more recent research that has to deal with one of the very fundamental things we think we know about strong attitudes, and that's they're difficult to change. And what that has meant in the literature for all this time is that any persuasion technique that you come up with, and there are many, we all know there are many, many different ways that people talk about going about changing attitudes, from classical conditioning to giving them a message for them to think about, very thoughtful, non-thoughtful ways. All of those techniques work better when your attitudes are weak, right? That's sort of one of the foundational things we think we know about strong attitudes. Any technique is easier to use on a weak attitude than it is on a strong attitude. And it doesn't matter what the nature of that strength is, if it's knowledge or morality and so forth. And so some of the newer research has begun to suggest that there are actually some ways of going about some persuasion techniques that might actually work better on strong attitudes than they do on weak attitudes, right? And so from a traditional attitude strength perspective, that's kind of crazy, right? A technique that works better when your attitudes are more difficult to change than it does when attitudes are supposedly easier to change. So let's talk about that a little bit. So here's our mask wearing example again. And so if I wanted to change your attitude on mask wearing from, I think wearing masks is bad during the pandemic, to good, and I had a measure of strength based on the emotion or the certainty or the morality or whatever it is that I used, it should be easier to change someone who's not as sure or has low emotion associated with that attitude than someone who has high emotion or is certain or based on morality, right? That's the core principle of attitude strength, more difficult to change strong attitudes. So let's look at emotion, and I'm going to go back to a study, not one that we did, but one of the earliest studies on changing attitudes based on high or low emotion. Oh, this is just a paper showing that emotional attitudes are more difficult to change on average than non-emotional attitudes. But research for many years has already shown that you can change attitudes that are based on emotion by using a matched sort of message. What is matching? Matching is when you use a message that's congruent with the nature of the attitude. So what do I mean by using a message that's congruent with the attitude? Well, if you have an attitude based on emotion, you should use an emotional message. If you have an attitude based on cognition, you should use a cognitive message. So I'm going to tell you about the results very quickly of this now classic paper by Carey Edwards back in 1990. So this is something that's been around, but it was just thought as a matching study. But let's look at this study from the point of view of attitude strength, where we have two kinds of attitudes: the affect-based attitude and the cognition-based attitude, so down there on the lower axis. And then we have two kinds of messages: the affective message that uses emotion, and the cognitive message that doesn't use emotion but uses reasons and arguments. And you can see the matching effect, right? That the affect-based attitude is changed more by the affective than the cognitive message, but the cognitive message changes attitudes more with the cognitive than the affective message. But looking at this from the point of view of attitude strength, you can say if you look at the affective message, it actually was more effective in changing the stronger attitude, which is the affective-based attitude, than it was in changing the weaker attitude, the one that was generally thought to be easier to change, the cognitive attitudes. So attitude strength has never been applied to this research. It's just sort of like, oh, look, it's a matching study. But if you think about it, because affect wasn't thought to be a strength indicator back then, but it is now, and there's good evidence that it's harder to change people's emotionally based attitudes or cognitive attitudes, you can say, oh, this seems to be an early study that suggests this kind of message works better on the stronger attitude, which really shouldn't happen. Okay, let's now turn to some newer research. Let's see, is that sort of a one-off phenomena, that it's just about affect, or there's something special about that? So let's turn to a dimension that's attained a lot of attention these days, whether our attitudes are based on morality or not. One interesting side note is it seems like the number of our attitudes, at least in the West, that are based on morality or people claim to be based on morality is ever increasing, right? And politicians are turning more things into moral issues. Healthcare is a moral issue. Abortion's a moral issue. Voting rights is a moral issue, right? So everyone's trying to turn things. And to the extent that that's successful, we start to think of these things as moral issues. It should be more difficult to change our opinions going forward, which is not great for a civilized discourse if we're all just in our corners and not changing. So just a paper showing that you can just let people think their attitude is based on morality. Just framing something as a moral issue does make people dig in, and their attitudes become more resistant to change, even when they get the same message, than if they thought, oh, this is just a practical issue for me. So the question then is, like the research on affective and cognitive matching, what about matching to morality? So we did this paper a couple of years ago about challenging moral attitudes with moral as opposed to practical messages. So I'll tell you a little bit about a couple studies we did here. So in the research, we got some online participants, and we assessed their attitudes toward the topic of recycling. We also assessed their moral basis. Did they think their attitude was based in morality or in practicality? And people vary. Some people think recycling is just kind of a practical thing. Others think, no, it's a moral imperative to save the environment. Then they always read a counter-attitudinal message on the topic, so trying to move them away from whatever their position was. Then they reported their attitudes and their party identification. So a practical message, this is an anti-recycling message, would be framed as, well, recycling's unwise and it's impractical. Recycling requires an increase in trucks that increase traffic congestion. So these are just very practical considerations for people. Or the moral version would be, recycling is a grave moral transgression. All right, so very clearly this is a moral thing. Recycling releases toxic fumes that are harmful to pets and animals, so harm is a very important dimension when people think about morality. So they got one or the other of these messages that on average, just if you average across a bunch of people who got each, they're about equally persuasive. All right? But look what happens when you look at those who had a moral basis and versus a practical basis to their attitude, and whether they got the moral message in red or the practical message in green. And one unexpected finding from this research is that political ideology, so people are more conservative as you move to the right of the screen. You can see, if you want to see the strongest effect, you look at the most conservative people in our sample. If you want to see the weakest, even non-significant effect, you look at the most liberal people in our sample. But the direction is identical for all the groups and very significant overall. But let's look at the where the pattern is the clearest, even though it's there for the others. So you can see that there's the matching effect, right? That the red moral message works better than the practical message for those people who have moral attitudes. But boy, the practical message works better than the moral message for those who identified their attitude as practical. So that is the matching effect. You match the message to the nature of the attitude. But from our point of view, what we want to focus on is you can see the green message is less and less effective as the moral basis increases. So that would be like the standard attitude strength effect. If you gave a standard kind of practical message, which many of our messages are or have been in the literature, the more the attitude is morally based, the harder it was to change the attitude. And you can say, yeah, that's there for that particular message. But if you look at the moral message, you go, ooh, look, the opposite's happening. The message gets more effective, the line is on a positive linear slope, the more strong the attitude is. Right? So that's the one that looks opposite from what you'd expect from a total attitude strength perspective. It's getting easier to change their attitude the stronger the attitude was. Okay. So did a second study just for purposes of replicability. Had a different topic. This is about the legalization of marijuana. Just like the previous study, they get a morally framed message or a practically framed message, legalizing marijuana unwise and impractical, or it's harmful and immoral, and had political ideology here again. And again, you can see that the results aren't as beautiful as the previous one, unfolding perfectly, but again, you can see it's there. The direction is there for everyone. And again, we get the matching effect, but also, in this case, the red message is more effective the stronger the attitude is. Okay. I have one more here. Of course, during COVID, had to do some research using COVID as a topic. And this is kind of interesting because health messages in general, there's been a lot of research in the past showing that there are sort of two ways to frame a health message. You could say it's good for you, will help you avoid getting coronavirus if you wear a mask, for example, or you want to protect other people. So these are two posters that these aren't ones we used, but other researchers were trying to see what was better here. And there's been a lot of research on this topic. This is one of the classic studies about hand washing, that they put signs in a restroom, and it was either protect your patient. This was for doctors, the doctor's restroom at the hospital. It was either protect your patients by washing your hands, or protect yourself from disease from washing hands. And in that particular case, the protect your patients message worked better. They had surreptitiously were watching whether the doctors wash their hands. It's unfortunate there's variance in that, but apparently there's enough variance to use it as a dependent measure. During COVID, it turns out On average, this is just one example study, even though the other framed message worked better on average for doctors and in some other studies, for COVID, these two messages weren't that differentially effective. Right? So it's like, what's going on with COVID? Why are the messages equally effective instead of one being better than the other? And of course, we said, well, maybe this is a case of moral matching. The moral message should only be more effective for people who see health as a moral issue or COVID as a moral issue. If it's just a practical thing, then a moral message shouldn't be as effective. So what's a moral message here? Well, it turns out people see protecting others as a moral message, whereas protecting yourself is kind of a selfish thing, right? It's not a moral saving society. And so this classic variable, self versus other messaging, can be translated into moral versus practical messaging. Protecting yourself is kind of practical. Protecting others is a bit more moral, right? So what we wanted to do is to see if you get this matching effect in the COVID domain for self versus other protection messages. And so we had to assess whether people think health is a moral issue or not. Okay, so that's this paper from 2021. So very similar to the other work I told you about. In this case, we had, in one study, sort of 200 people replicated this with a much larger sample, and we assessed their attitudes and the moral, their attitudes on social distancing, and we also assessed whether they thought health was a moral thing, protecting health, or whether it's kind of a practical thing. You know, if you can work longer because it's you don't get sick. Then they reported their attitudes and political ID, since we saw that was important in the other research. So the self-protective message was, other people may have the virus, but this is about your health. You need to distance in order to protect yourself. The other protective message, or we could call it the moral message, was about this is something you can do to protect older adults. And we all saw all of these different versions of these messages, right, during COVID. But we have a specific hypothesis about for whom each message should be more effective. And so these are the results from study 1, where, again, you can see that the moral message is particularly effective for those who see health as a moral issue. Or again, thinking about it differently, the moral message gets more effective as the strength of the attitude increases, whereas the practical message gets less effective. That's the typical effect. And then we, replicated that in the second study with a larger sample. Okay, so the moral matching effects were replicated for this health issue in the COVID context, and it more generally helps us understand when each of these kinds of message frames will be more important, right? We need to know something about whether you think of something as a moral issue or not. And across the average, because on average there's no difference across a sample, at least in the US, some think health is a moral issue, some think it's not, the messages will come out kind of equally effective overall, which is what some of the research that looked at it without looking at this moderator seemed to show. Okay, so if we want to persuade people with strong attitudes, we can try to match the message to the basis of the attitude. And that sounds really easy, but often we don't know the basis of the attitude, right? And then you have to, is it moral, is it emotional? You know, what is the basis? And so it would require a lot of knowledge about your sample. So we wondered, and then you'd have to develop different kinds of messages, moral messages and emotional messages and so on and so forth. So we wondered, is there a way, is there a technique, so the matching technique well established in the literature, but is there a more general way, a more general technique that would be effective in changing stronger attitudes? Okay? More generic strategy, and that's what this research is about. So the initial idea was, if you have a really strong attitude, meaning you're certain of it, it's important to you, it's based on your morals, you're emotional about it, you would especially appreciate someone acknowledging your position. Right? If the issue isn't that important to you, it's not based on morality, and someone agrees with you, it isn't that big a deal. But when it's something that's fundamental to you, it's self-defining, maybe it's tied to your identity, then when someone goes, yeah, you have a good point there, you go, yes, I like you, I like you. And that's particularly powerful when your attitude is strong. So could we take advantage of that people really like being validated when their attitudes are strong? And so the basic idea was that if the message acknowledges some validity to your point of view, you will then be open to acknowledging some validity to my point of view. All right? Because you really appreciate that I've honestly appreciated your viewpoint. So you'll be open to me. Well, that is sort of the principle of reciprocity that we've known about for a long time. If I do something for you, you feel obligated to do something for me, right? I do you a favor, you'll do me a favor. And so the twist here, so reciprocity, well-known finding, people are susceptible to it, that this reciprocity will be especially strong when our attitudes are strong. Because now you really, if I acknowledge again a weaker attitude, you go, yeah, that's nice, I like you. But if you acknowledge one of my strong attitudes, then I really appreciate it. Right? So reciprocity stronger for stronger attitudes. And so you should be especially likely to be open to my point of view on stronger attitudes, which is the phenomena we want to study. So a message that acknowledges your point of view has also been studied in social psychology for a long time, and that's called a two-sided message. One-sided message just presents my point of view. Two-sided message, it says, yeah, you've got some good points. I think my points are better, but I don't think my points are the only ones, because I acknowledge some of yours too. And so there's been some research on two-sided messages. It's never been entirely clear when they're better than one-sided messages or not. There's some early work on intelligence, and two-sided messages tend to work better, at least for the Army troops during World War II, who had scored higher on intelligence tests. They did better with the two-sided messages than the one-sided messages. But we want to relate two-sided messages to this notion of reciprocity, and our key prediction is that a two-sided message will be especially effective when people have a strong attitude. Okay, so this is the first set of studies recently published in PSBB, and we wanted to use moral messages because we knew you could use moral messages to change people with moral attitudes, but we wanted a different technique that could change people with morally based attitudes, and so we wanted to use this idea about two-sided messages. I want to say, going into this, we thought, moral attitudes are really difficult to change. So as a precursor to changing your attitude, we wanted to assess how open you are to my point of view, because in various theories, especially stages of change, theories of attitudes, I kind of have to open you up to be changed. So we wanted to measure this precursor, so openness or receptiveness, which is also a concept in the persuasion literature that's getting a lot more attention these days. Sometimes it's called openness, sometimes it's called receptiveness, but it's measured with things like, are you willing to read more about this other side? And so that kind of suggests you're open as opposed to being closed. I don't want to read any more about that side. Yeah, I'll read some more. Yeah, I recognize the merit of the position, and I'm feeling receptive. So all of these things should open you up to change. Okay, so in our first message, we used the topic of gun control, a very salient topic in the U.S. today. This was a good topic for us because some people think gun violence is a moral problem, and you can find lots of articles and advocacy about that. But some people think it's just impractical. I'd go for it, but I just don't think it works. I don't think it will affect crime. It's just a kind of a practical reason to be against it. So we, again, had an online sample. We assessed their attitudes and the moral basis of their attitudes about gun control. They read a two-sided counter-attitudinal message on gun control, and then they reported their attitudes and openness to the message position. The key manipulation here is they either get only two strong arguments in favor of the author's position, which could be pro or against gun control, the opposite to whatever the subject's attitude was, so we had all the variations of the message. Or they got a message that had the same two strong arguments, The one change is it also presents just one strong argument on the other side. You know, here's a reason you might be against gun control or for gun control that makes sense, but here are the arguments that I really think are better. So just a little acknowledgement. And wow, does it make a big difference? And so if you look at the one-sided message, the green bar, that's the normal thing you see when your attitude is based on morality. I reject that message more and more, that one-sided message. No, you're not going to change me. I'm moral and certain or whatever. So that's the typical effect. But look at the red line. This message, just a two-sided message, just a little acknowledgement of your position, gets better and better in creating openness as your attitude is more based on morality. Okay, so that's what we were hoping to find. Green light, red light. And that openness is a mediator of actually changing your attitude. So I also assessed attitudes. And so if I can get, the more I could get you to be open to my side with a two-sided message, the more you actually then change your attitude to move closer to my side. Okay, I'm going to not go through the details of these because this is just a replication of the study with one additional condition that I wanted to point out. So some people might say, well, is any two-sided message good, or do I have to really respectfully acknowledge your side? So this study had the one-sided message, the two-sided message that gave one strong argument on the other side, just like I did before. But the new condition is a two-sided message that gives a very weak argument on the other side. So it's like disrespecting your side, almost. But I'm acknowledging, well, some people think this on the other side, but I still favor my point of view. And so this replicates what I showed you before. The two-sided strong message gets more effective, but look at the two-sided weak message. That's really no different from a one-sided message. So it's not just the form of acknowledging someone else has something to say. You have to really take it seriously and give them a good reason for it. Okay, what's going on here? This is on masking, same interaction. The two-sided message on masking works better. That's all with moral messages. Is that the only strength indicator for which this works? In some research that will be coming out in PSPB, we wanted to look at some other indicators of strength, in this case, certainty and importance. So nothing about morality here. Won't go through the details, but look at the results. The same interaction. That two-sided message gets more and more effective the more certain people are in their attitude. So not about morality. And then I'll tell you about one more study just because it has a different strength indicator. This was one where we used group identification. How much is the attitude tied to your group? And in this case, we tried to take a strong one at your political group, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And so the message either just talks about how great one side is, your party, or acknowledges, yeah, if you're giving a pro-Democratic, yeah, the Republicans have some good points about this, but, here's the Democratic, and you get the same outcome. Okay, so the benefits of these two-sided messages worked regardless of the topic, regardless of the strength indicator, morality, group identity, whatever it was. And so it shows a particularly promising way of changing strong attitudes based on reciprocity. Okay, so all persuasion techniques work better for weak than strong attitudes. No, some persuasion techniques might actually work better for strong attitudes than weak attitudes. Okay, now the last thing I want to tell you about is another canonical consequence of having strong attitudes. Strong attitudes predict behavior better than weaker. When you're certain, you're more likely to do something than if you're uncertain. And so the new twist is that, no, maybe sometimes weaker attitudes can predict behavior better than stronger attitudes. Okay, so we're going to move from enduring to impactful. A canonical point of view, stronger attitudes predict better than weaker attitudes. So if we're trying to predict mask wearing from attitudes, there should be a general positive slope. The more positive you are toward mask wearing, the more you should actually wear a mask. But if we also measured attitude certainty, that prediction of behavior from attitudes should be stronger for the more certain attitudes, right? So the slope is steeper when you're certain. Those attitudes predict behavior better than when the attitudes are uncertain. Not that they don't predict necessarily when they're uncertain, but just not as well. That's the classic attitude strength finding. And having strong attitudes has enhanced prediction across a whole variety of different behaviors. But in the attitudes literature, we tend not to study extreme behaviors, right? It's, will you purchase this product? Will you brush your teeth? Will you wear a mask? Those are all fine, good behaviors. But what about, who will commit violence on behalf of their attitude? Wow, that's something we don't tend to study very much because it's difficult, right? Difficult to study. Yet people did commit violence about their mask-wearing attitude. Just like, not only am I not going to wear a mask, but I'm going to punch you in the face because you asked me to wear one, right? And so there were a whole bunch of violent incidents related to what might be seen as kind of a mundane attitude. And so the initial thinking from attitude strength research is, oh, this must be the people who have a moral basis to their attitude, and they must be the most certain people of their attitudes who are committing this violence. Yet, if you look at the literature on attitude strength, there are some hints that weakness can sometimes be associated with more action. And the thing that seems to be present in a variety of situations where weakness leads to more extreme action is some sort of threat, right? So there's a variety of research in social psychology says that threat can lead vulnerable people, and by vulnerable people, people who are weak in some way, shape, or form, to act more extremely, like commit violence. And so an example of this is kind of, you may be familiar with research in Arroyo's on fragile self-esteem, right? People who think they're great, I have high self-esteem, but it's fragile in some way. And the way in which it's fragile varies across different kinds of studies and measures. But everyone agrees that, yes, it's not only high, but it's not secure. It's fragile. And those people are the ones who are most prone to be aggressive and defend themselves, right? Other research on violent extremism, it seems that people who've been damaged or hurt or embarrassed in some way are more likely to commit violence. Maybe the most relevant research in the attitudes literature is work on compensatory conviction, that if you're thinking about your own death, then you're more likely to adopt a really extreme attitude to protect yourself and feel strong, even though you just made me feel weak. And so our prediction was that people with weak or fragile attitudes, to use the language of the self-esteem literature, they will try to compensate for this weakness by doing something that shows how strong they are, which could include acting extremely. I'm not so weak. My attitude's not weak. Look how not weak it is. And so what are we going to look for in this research? This is the typical, what we'll call the assured attitude behavior consistency effect, where attitudes that are more extreme predict behavior better than attitudes that are more certain predict behavior better than attitudes that are low in certainty. A compensatory effect would look like this, just the opposite, right? Where it's the people whose attitudes are fragile in some ways that are most likely to act on those attitudes. And so you can see in the top, the red thing there, that would be like the high self-esteem. This is the person who has a really strong attitude in terms of its valence on some topic, but they're uncertain of it, so it's fragile. They're the ones who are going to be most likely to say, I'm going to do something like commit violence. Okay, and so violence is an extreme behavior, and we think this is going to be especially likely to occur when the issue is threatening in some way. Let me just show you the basic phenomena. I won't be able to tell you about all the studies, but the first one will give you the sense of what we find in this line of research. So in this case, we used attitudes toward abortion, which is another hot topic, especially in the US. We measured their attitudes and their certainty, and then we measured their willingness to engage in extreme behaviors using 5 items from the SWAN scale. Like I'd fight to defend my attitude, I would hurt others if they, didn't agree with me, and so it's a pretty violent kind of stuff. And we get this two-way interaction. That these are the people who are low in their certainty. It's those individuals who say, I'm more willing to do these extreme things. The high certain people, they just generally don't. I'm comfortable with my attitude, I don't need to prove anything to you, and their attitudes don't relate to violence, mostly because they're just not doing much, saying they're willing to do much of it. Okay, last study I'll tell you about. This one we wanted to look at whether threat moderated, and so we measured how threatening the topic of abortion or restricting it was to them, and so these are the results for those who say it's high in threat. This effect does not occur for those low in threat. And then the final thing, we wanted to vary whether we asked about extreme actions or moderate actions, right? So extreme things are like, I'll fight those who disagree with me, but all of that research didn't show that we get the normal effect for typical moderate behavior, so we wanted to show that as well. So this study's about social distancing, I think, to stop the threat, and we also rated threat. And so let's look at the extreme behaviors. Here you can see the compensatory pattern, right? More action for the red bar, uncertain people. For the moderate behaviors, we see just the opposite. More action for the certain behaviors, more attitude-behavior consistency. Okay, and that's moderated by threat. Don't need to know about that. And let me get to my conclusions. So, structural and perceived measures are different. They can predict different outcomes or the same outcome in different situations. Although most of the time, persuasion techniques work better on weaker attitudes. There are some techniques, and I think this will be a growing area of research in the future, about particular ways to get at people who have those strongest attitudes, because that's become a way of bridging the divide among people. And then finally, this last one, although stronger attitudes do tend to guide normal behavior, which is pretty much what we mostly study, that when we get to extreme behaviors, the pattern might change in a dramatic way. And it's those whose attitudes are fragile in some way that might be more impacted. So thank you very much for listening. These are my collaborators on the first line of research on strength, collaborators on the second line of research on changing stronger attitudes, and then collaborators, very important, on the third line of research, which is yet to be published. We're still working on it, on compensatory attitude behavior consistency. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Well, following the advice of Professor Petty, I'm going to say that making questions after a talk is a moral issue, so go ahead.
Yes?
I come from a very different field. I'm an experimental psychologist, and I find this very interesting, and I'm thinking about the application of these findings in developmental psychology, not so much in elderly as in child raising, to stop, obviously, violent or extreme behaviors in the future.
Yeah, a very interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about developmental psychology, but I would guess, and if there are developmental psychologists in the audience, please elaborate on anything I might say that might not be correct. But I imagine, children develop a sense of self over time, and so this might be related to secure or insecure attachment, for example, that maybe a child who's secure won't react to threats in the same way as a child who is insecure. So that might relate to the fragility of self-esteem or sense of self. It's a while before kids develop attitudes, especially towards social topics, but I can imagine this phenomenon might start fairly early and be a fairly fundamental self-protective kind of thing. And so the self is the most important attitude object, so it makes sense that research would start with fragile self-esteem. What I think about myself. And so I think one of the interesting things about our research, it shows kind of how that same kind of notion can be applied to more mundane attitudes, when my attitudes are under threat. I really think something's great, but I'm not so sure why, or I don't think I can defend it. Then I literally defend it, with my fists, or being willing to do something extreme. One of the things we haven't done yet so much is to look at extreme positive behaviors. So if extremity is just a matter of signaling, an extreme positive behavior might present the same reaffirmation of who I am as an extreme negative behavior. So it could apply to positive behaviors, which we haven't studied so much yet. Or it could be unique to negative behaviors, or in violence in particular. And so some of the research we have, where we have the extreme behaviors rated on how violent they are, the patterns are stronger for the violent negative behaviors than some of the other behaviors, which are still negative, like getting someone fired at work is a pretty extreme behavior, but not violent. And the pattern's still there, but not as strong. So it'll be interesting to see over time where that happens, and to start to investigate these problems with children. So thanks for that question. Yes?
Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question for the second block of research. So you show a lot of evidence of strong attitudes moving around, like weak attitudes, like we thought weak attitudes used to move around. And I wonder, have those strong attitudes become weaker, or do we have any evidence of those strong attitudes remaining as strong after they move around?
We have tried to measure not only does the openness in attitude change, but do people become less certain, for example, in those attitudes after they change. And one reasonable hypothesis, which is what you might be suggesting, is that they also become a little weaker, which opens them up to more change. And there's a little evidence for that. And so we look at, if your attitude became a little weaker, is that what mediated your change? And the openness is a much stronger mediator. So it's like, at least so maybe you had a several step model that first I become open, and I also start to doubt my view a little bit, and both of those together produce it either in a parallel or serial way. But for right now, that's not a big effect, but the trends are always in that direction, getting weaker, and we thought, well, maybe they'll even get stronger. It's like, you've acknowledged me, so I'm going to try to redouble my efforts and get stronger. And maybe some people are getting stronger and some are getting weaker, and if we knew the moderator of that, that's why they're canceling each other out. But yeah, something very interesting to pursue. Thanks.
Over here.
Yeah, very interesting talk. And I'm not an expert on attitude, but sometimes the fool can ask very interesting questions. So with that optimism, I thought that when I look at the last part of your talk, and you talk about fragility, that concerns the self primarily, right? It's a bit about the self, but it's a little bit farther away from attitude, specific attitude. So to what degree is this about the self, and is it limited to the self, that just a fragile self is just more open to change and doing things that are not common, versus, or is it broader than the self? Is it linked to the attitude?
People with fragile attitudes, meaning they're very positive towards something, but they're uncertain. They don't have lower self-esteem overall. They're not more narcissistic. So I don't think there's sort of a general correlation between having this fragile attitude and just being fragile in general. Because I think it's not the case that all of my attitudes are fragile. So you could have a fragile attitude about abortion, but have a very unfragile attitude, very secure attitude about capital punishment or some other topic. And so there need to be kind of a correlation among the fragility of all of your attitudes. And then you'd say, yeah, what's at the core of it is fragile self-esteem. But it bounces around from topic to topic. So a person who's fragile on one isn't fragile on another. So I think it's more idiosyncratic to the particular attitude. That doesn't mean there isn't some connection to the self. And so for a person for whom their abortion attitude is very self-defining for them, the effect could potentially be stronger than for someone who doesn't link it to themselves, where it's detached from me. So I think that could be there. We don't know yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was there. But that's a much more specific kind of linkage than saying it's the same people who have overall fragile self-esteem.
I think we have room for 2 more questions. One on the top, yes.
On the basis of attitude, you mentioned emotion and morality. So my question is, how do you separate these 2 bases of attitude, since negative emotions like guilt, embarrassment, and shame often motivate people to act morally or ethically? So how can you better identify if you're dealing with emotion or morality, and how can you better choose a persuasive method if it's based on emotion, so you can use an emotional one or a morality one, as they are often so intricate?
Yeah, great question. So if you didn't hear the question, like how do you separate the moral basis of the attitude from the emotional basis, for example, because moral attitudes tend to be more emotional, right? So there's a correlation between morality and emotion. There's also a correlation between morality and certainty. People tend to be more certain in their moral attitudes, right? So in real life, those things sort of form a cluster of strength. And you might say, in the real world, we wouldn't care about which one it was, because they tend to go together, and so we know, oh, let's use the 2-sided message technique. We don't care which one it is. In the research, we care whether these things are different. So in all of the studies I mentioned, let's say we're looking at moral basis. We also measure certainty and affective cognitive basis, and we can control for those and say the moral effect holds above and beyond even after you take out the certainty and the emotion confounds. And similarly, if I want to make a case about emotion, I want to show it holds when I take out the certainty and moral and importance, and we have a whole battery of things that we want to take out to make sure that, for conceptual reasons, we know this particular variable can produce the effect on its own. But that's a very, very important thing to consider in this kind of research.
Okay, we already ran out of time, but we have only the last 2 questions. Yeah, over here.
Hello, very interesting, the 2 sides effect. I was asking myself if you have think about how the perception of a social conflict negates this effect, because I'm thinking that maybe it's not the same a moral issue that you don't perceive after a social conflict, or if you think that there is a big social conflict after this moral issue, maybe it makes you more interested in a 2 sides missions. Maybe it's a variable that is affecting this, because at the end social influence is based in conflict. Have you think about it?
Yeah, I haven't, but I really like the question, and I'm going to think about it some more, because I think you're saying that for any given issue, say, some issues like abortion, everybody knows 2 sides are out there, right? So it's not a surprise that there's a social conflict about abortion. So everybody comes in knowing that the 2 sides are there, and so all that is happening there is the fact that you're acknowledging my side, and it makes me feel good. But there may be some topics or some people, even for a given topic, who have no idea there's 2 sides, right? And so in the classic literature, that is one of the explanations given for why intelligent people like 2-sided messages more. The argument at the time, I don't know if they've ever done research to validate this, was that people lowered intelligence were less likely to know that there are 2 sides. So giving the other side, like, oh my God, there's another side to this, I didn't even know that. And so that message backfires, because they thought, oh, there's only one side. Right? And intelligent people know there are 2 sides, so if you don't acknowledge it, you just seem like you're not very sophisticated. Like you don't even know there's another side to this topic. But for some other issues, in a contemporary way, it'd be really interesting to see the extent to which that kind of perception coming into the study might moderate for whom the 2-sided message is especially effective. So thanks for that suggestion.
And the last one.
Thank you. You've been referring to affect-based and content-based attitude, but how can you differentiate them? What specific measures are sensitive to the emotional, to affective component of attitudes?
I assess whether the attitude is based on affect or cognition, right? So there are 2 ways to do it. The objective way is I might take a topic like something simple like ice cream, and so first I'll try to measure, do you get happy happy when you eat ice cream? I'll ask a bunch of emotional questions about ice cream. And then I'll ask a bunch of cognitive questions. How useful is ice cream? That would be a practical question. And then I'll measure how much you like ice cream. And I'll see, oh, for you, the only thing that predicts how much you like ice cream are all the emotions. So your attitude empirically seems to be based on emotion. For someone else, the emotion items don't predict how much you like ice cream. It's only the responses to the cognitive ones. So that's the so-called objective way or structural way of assessing affective and cognitive bases. Which ones really predict the attitude? The alternative is just to ask you, think about ice cream. Is that based on your emotions? Or is that based on your beliefs about ice cream, not just ask you? And it turns out those two ways of measuring affective and cognitive bases are completely uncorrelated. They're zero. This is one of the rare times that between the perceptual and the structural one is totally absent. So we seem to have no insight that our attitudes are being driven by one or the other. And it isn't all because people, when we first did this, people thought, oh, it's because everyone denies that their attitudes are based on emotion. No, there's some people who want to be driven by emotion. They have a need for affect, as some research has shown. And so they make the opposite mistake. Their attitudes are actually driven by all these practical cognitive questions, but they think they're emotionally driven, but they're not. So it can go either way. But those are two ways, which is why they tend to predict different kinds of outcomes.
So you never use implicit measures?
Not in the research on affect and cognition. That could be a third way, and it'd be interesting. My guess is the implicit measures would correlate more strongly with the structural basis, because that's more indirect or implicit, what actually predicts your attitude, than what you think predicts your attitude, at least in domains that it works that way. But that would be interesting way. Pablo and I did some research on implicit certainty once. We used an IAT to try to see how associated confidence and certainty was with the attitude. So there has been some work using implicit measures in the domain of strength, but really not very much. But it'd be an interesting thing to pursue.
Thank you very much. Well, our next presenter is Professor Karen Douglas from Kent University. Her main focus is beliefs on conspiracy theories, and today she will be talking about why people believe in these kind of things, why they tend to follow these ideas, what are the consequences. As the rest of the authors, Karen has published several papers, and I think that nowadays she's leading one European Research Council project about this topic, and we are lucky. coffee as well. They are human, so. Well, our next speaker is Professor Ángel Gómez from Universidad Nacional a Distancia, UNED. Professor Gómez is one of the pioneers in the study of identity fusion and basically study about how the connection to a group is making you to make extreme behaviors. Basically, that would be the summary. As well as Karen, he's currently the director of a European Research Council project about the radicalization processes. Like the rest, I'm not going to mention specifically, but he published several papers in this line. And today we are lucky to have him speaking about the causes and role identity fusion in radicalization processes. Muchas gracias, Ángel.
Hello, can you hear me? First of all, I have to say thanks to Alfredo and to all the organizers. This talk is particularly special to me. It's very challenging or threatening, and I feel like an impostor here, because when I saw the rest of the speakers, I don't know why I'm here. But I have an advantage, is that I am playing at home, because I studied in this university. I studied in Complutense University, although I am a professor now in UNED. So if there is some students here, psychology students from Complutense University, today my talk is for you. Because when I was here, I didn't speak English. I didn't have any opportunity to have a grant. And now, a long, long time after that, I am here for giving a talk. So maybe in a few years, some of you could be here, right? Also, I like it. I really enjoyed the two first presentations. The two of them are co-authors in some of my papers. Maybe they don't know, because I am Ángel Gómez, and it's like if I was John Smith in the US, right? But I like it that Rich in particular introduces some scale, the SWAN scale. I did that scale, not Bill, right? But he is the first author. And also, Karen talked about how difficult it is to find some particular samples for measuring your theory. Don't worry, we already have measures, and you are involved, but you don't remember. But you will see during my talk that we have the opportunity of collecting data with some particular samples that are very relevant. Let me give you an example before starting. We did one study with prisoners, and we asked about your theory with one item. And they had to respond between 0 and 6 to prisoners. And some of them say, no, maybe there is not a conspiracy theory. 5, between 0 and 6. And some others say, there is not 100, so I have to just say 6. So it's really relevant in our field. And also, the last thing before starting is that in part, there is a matching issue here. Because for doing research about general attitudes, you use general populations. But if you want to talk about terrorism, you need to talk to terrorists. And this is what we did. Not only me, also my team, all of them are sitting there, so they know more than me about terrorism, so I'm just a vehicle about the research, right? So which is the problem that we want to study? Terrorism. Terrorism is one of the biggest challenges, together with the COVID, of course, and is a priority for the United Nations in this decade. And then we have to find a solution for a response to study terrorism. And one of the solutions is to have a strong theoretical support. There is a lot of people that do research about terrorism, but there is not a theory behind all the research. And also, it's extremely relevant to do field research with people who have been terrorists, that are terrorists, or that could be terrorists in the future. So for that reason, our research is in between social psychology and anthropology. Take into account that less than 3% of research introduce empirical data with terrorism. So you can imagine how many experts in the world there is about terrorism. In our study, we have more than 500, but only in the study that I am going to show you today, later. So we have certain experience, and it's more difficult than it could be expected. And also something very challenging is the methodology. Usually, the research on terrorism uses qualitative interviews. It's very difficult to analyze. And what we have done is to combine qualitative and quantitative research. And also, very relevant, we have learned from terrorists. If we ask something and they don't understand, or they suggest, you should ask this question in a different way. This is what we do, right? You will see later. Then our approach in the next few years, because I also have a grant, like the grant from Karen, is to combine a multi-theory, multi-method approach and combining also different kind of samples to study this phenomenon. Which is the theory? Which is the main theory that we use, although we consider also alternative theories, is identity fusion. Identity fusion was developed because a colleague of mine, Bill Swan, and I thought, how is possible that some people are willing to die for their group or for their values? He is American, I am from Madrid, so you can imagine how damaging could be these attacks. And then we developed a way of measuring identity fusion, some pairs of circles. Those participants who choose the last circle on the right, we think that they are fused with a group, because fusion is a visceral feeling of oneness with a group. In the last few years, this process has been extended to other targets, but the original theory was focused on the group. Our idea was that those people who are fused with a group are more willing to fight, die, and to commit extreme behaviors on behalf of the group. And these are some of the items that Rich already showed, is that we developed a 7-item scale trying to see whether people are willing to fight and die for the group. This is just intentions, but this was the first paper that we published. In the next paper, we also included behaviors. And if we know that those who are fused with a group are more willing to fight and die for the group, how is it possible that this motivation can increase? One way of increasing is this motivation is by physical arousal. When people are activated, when their arousal increases, they are even more willing to fight and die for the group. We published a paper where we use a video game, and we found that those people who are activated through physical exercise are even more willing to fight and die for their group, and also we included other measures that correlated with fight and die. Also, the emotional arousal. When people are conscious that people from their group can die, they are willing to self-sacrifice for the group. For example, in the trolley dilemma, we did several variations of this dilemma, and we always found that those who are fused with the group are more willing to self-sacrifice for the group. And also when they are excluded or rejected by the group. When someone is excluded from the group, they have two options. They can leave and search for another group, or they can fight and try that the group accept them. Those who are fused don't leave the group. They fight for the group, right? And also, when we started to publish the first kind of papers about identity fusion, reviewers usually said, but what happened? There is only identity fusion in Spain, because all the studies included Spanish participants. So we did one study in the 5 continents with 11 countries, where we found a strong correlation between identity fusion and a willingness to fight and die for the group. Maybe some of you are thinking, what about social identity? I am not going to refer to social identity because it's a fight with all the reviewers, and we have already demonstrated that identity fusion is not super identification, and it's a different process, right? So trust. And identity fusion has been extended to other contexts. For example, to the political domain. In the elections in the US and in Spain, we measured fusion before the election and after. And we found that those who are fused with a political party who lose the election thought that they was going to die, that their health was going to be worse, probably that they would have negative consequences. We also applied identity fusion to the cross-gender domain. And we did one longitudinal study with transsexuals. And we found that those who are fused with the group they want to belong are more willing to do all the change to be a woman or to be a man. And this is a real behavior, right? So it's not willing to do something. They do something. And it's very damaging. Also with twins. Alexandra Vázquez, a colleague of mine, is an expert, because if you think on identity fusion, where the idea is that the group and me are the same thing, maybe twins is the best example. So we also applied identity fusion to the interpersonal level, not only to the self, the relation between the self and the group. And also fusion with leaders. There is a paper that appears 3 years ago about fusion with Donald Trump, because something relevant is that until 2014 or 15, all the identity fusion paper was published by our lab, only Bill Swan and the lab in UNED. But after that date, there is about 200 papers of identity fusion from all over the world. So maybe identity fusion works, because there is more people that trust in this idea. But my idea was, we have developed this theory because maybe can explain why some people enter into a terrorist group and do these kind of things that all of us know. I was very happy last year because there was a group of researchers, not our team, that conducted a meta-analysis, and they found that between 15 predictors of radical intention, the first was identity fusion, those in the bottom. I don't know these guys, so they say this is what the research is saying. So maybe it would be important to use identity fusion to study extremism with terrorists. What kind of participants we use in our studies? It's normal that to understand a process is very easy, or it's easier to use online studies or students at the university, but in our case, we really want to demonstrate that this mechanism works with people who are really involved in this kind of behaviors. For example, we conducted one study in Morocco, in Tetuan and Casablanca, in some neighborhoods where there was people that could be in risk of radicalization. In fact, in these neighborhoods, there were people who was living there that committed the crimes of the Madrid bombist attacks, for example. And then, in these neighborhoods, we did a field study measuring identity fusion and also sacred values, and we found that those who were fused with Sharia, with a strong interpretation of Sharia, they were more willing to do self-sacrifices for their religion, right? We also conducted a study in Barcelona with two different kind of groups. One of them Pakistanis and other Moroccans that they are sympathetic or some extremist groups. And we did fMRI studies. I'm not going too deep into the fMRI results because I am not an expert, but we found that there is some parts of the brain or some connections of the brain that are related with identity fusion. In particular, when they are threatening or when they are excluded. Then some parts of the brain related with extreme behaviors that are more activated. So these participants are real participants that are under risk of radicalization, and identity fusion works. But we also have data with former terrorists. We have a group of ex-Tamil Tigers and also ex-members of the Islamic State, because not all terrorists are equal. If you think that some people can radicalize in some particular group, this doesn't mean that the process is going to be the same for all the groups. What we found is that the reason why they joined the group in the past are different, but it's relevant that they argue variables that are related with identity, in particular with the closeness or something related with identity fusion. And the methodology. In the last few years, I have been reading a lot of papers about terrorism and extremism, that some experts say how you can do this kind of research. But I think that they have never met a terrorist. You can't ask some of the scales that you can find in the literature. You can be sit in a prison with a terrorist and use a scale of 20 items because they are not going to respond to the 20 items. They don't understand half of them, or they don't want to respond to some of them. Then what can you do? You can use all the scale. Then we created our own methodology. Our own methodology is to use dynamic measures for some variables, not for all. But for example, we developed a measure of identity fusion, and this measure can be responded in a computer or also in an iPad, in a tablet, and the participant just need to move the circle, and when the circle is inside the big circle, they are fused with the group. And you can measure fusion with a group, with a value, with a leader, with their family members, etc., in a very brief period of time and in a different way. We also included another measure that we use in the field just after the conflict of the Islamic State, and we have fighters, Kurds and people from the military in Iraq, and we asked then, which is most important for you? Your most cherished value or your most cherished group? Because we found that all of them were fused with religion and fused with the battalion. And we found that those who choose the value instead of the group are the most extreme. And the same happened with a few group of terrorists that we have in the field. We also developed a measure of formidability. This measure is not our measure. Anthropologists created this measure, but we combine it. Instead of having a body with different sizes and different kind of muscularity, we integrate both, and we asked participants to what extent they perceive themselves or the group as strong. In this case, physical formidability doesn't mean that they are really strong. It's that their group is strong, they have power, they have weapons, etc. And in the field, they told us, this is not the right way of asking this question. You don't have to ask for physical formidability. You have to ask for spiritual formidability. And we say, what? But what is spiritual formidability? Is religion? And they say, no. It's conviction. It's that if you want to do something and if you believe in something, you will do it. And then only with this measure, we developed a lot of experiments, and we published a paper in Nature Human Behavior and another paper in PNAS trying to use this measure for the individual spiritual formidability. So this measure was really elaborated during an interview with a terrorist. We also have a video game, and participants have to decide if they want to shoot one icon or the other, and we found that those who are fused with the group prefer not winning anything, money, points, etc., but destroy the enemy. This is also published. And finally, another method that has been published last week in one research that we have conducted with female jihadists in prison is a measure of cohesion with the group. Right? This is just an example. We have more, but think that you need to do an interview in a prison with someone who is going to stay with you for almost 2 hours, and you need to talk to him, and you need to show the other guy that this is not a usual questionnaire. This is more interesting to respond, maybe for you too, right? So which is the best challenge to me? I was fighting for years to conduct one study in prisons, but I am Ángel Gómez, so my name is not very familiar for people in the Ministry of Penitentiary Institution. But finally, after 5 years of fighting, someone decided that I could have the possibility of conducting one study in prison, which is the reason why we started to conduct this study. It's because I'm obviously interested in the processes that are related with radicalization, but also in how this kind of research can help people who is working in prisons and the governments, how to develop a program of treatment to prevent radicalization or to de-radicalize. Also to prepare a tool to assess the risk of radicalization in prison. If we talk to terrorists or people who are in prison because it is suspected that they are terrorists, maybe we can obtain information that can be useful for the society, not only for writing papers, right? Obviously, writing paper is important, but if this is not there is no utility for the community, it doesn't make sense. And then finally, we conducted our first research just before the COVID. Obviously, there was a lot of people involved here, all my team who is sitting there, because it's not easy to do this kind of research. Think about any paper that you can read. You see study 1, study 2, study 3, 2,000 participants, 300, 1,000 participants. Here we have 500, but each participant is absolutely different. For having access to each participant, you need a lot of permissions. You need that the participant really trusts in what you are asking, that he or she doesn't think that you are asking something that could be damaging for them. Some of them are in the first degree in prison. They are in isolation. They stay 22 hours in their cell and only 2 hours out of the cell. So it's really painful, and it's really difficult sometimes to convince them to respond to someone who is going there to do a research, and they don't have anything to win, right? So this is only one study, but it's more than 1 year to conduct the study. Also, there is different groups of people who participated in our research. The group A are those who are in prison because they are terrorists, or the government that they are terrorists. Group B and C, they are also Muslims, but they entered into prison for different reasons, not related with terrorism. However, Group B are those who are recruiting others in prison, and the government knows that they are doing this kind of tasks. And Group C are those who can be radicalizing in prison. So this is a very interesting group. We also have a control Muslims group, those who are in prison, just they are Muslim, but as we are interested in particular in religion, we needed a control group. And we also had Latino gangs and organized crime. This is the first research in history that includes all these groups, because you can't understand jihadism or terrorism in particular if you don't have other groups of comparison. In the literature, usually they compare jihadism with Latino gangs. And what happened is that in most of the prisons in the world, they use the program of treatment that has been developed talking to Latino gangs, but not with terrorists. And they are quite different, as you are going to see. I am not going to show all the results, because we have different comparison, but I am going to focus only in the comparison between jihadists, controlled Muslim, Latino gangs, and delinquent bands. And this is published in scientific reports this year. We have other papers, and we have a web where you can find all the results of this particular study. So our proposal is to take into account different theories, not only identity fusion, also secret values and the 3N model. For example, Rich already talked about uncertainty and how people want to search for significance. It's related with this model. Also, our approach is multi-methodological, qualitative and quantitative. And obviously, our main goal is having an applied purpose. Program of intervention, violent radicalization risk assessment tool, and also considering the gender perspective. We also interviewed females. I'm not going to show the results of the females. As I have told you, this paper has been already published this week or last week, but it's very relevant because they are very different from males. And this has very important implications, because if you want to work in a program of treatment in prisons, you need to know that the program should be different for males than for females. First of all, we conducted a preliminary study. Anyone in my team never met a terrorist, so we don't know if they were going to respond or how to ask some particular question. One of our ideas was to find the most important group and the most important value for each of the group. And in this preliminary study, we found that for Muslims, jihadists or non-jihadists, the most important group was Muslims, and the most important value, religion. And in the case of Latino gangs and delinquent bands, the most important group was the band, and the value was the honor. What we did was to take into account this concept, and that the questionnaire was exactly the same in the second part, but we always changed the value or the group that was most relevant for them. And we also needed a dependent variables. What we did was to develop one scale. We asked them about the sacrifices that are really costly for them in prison. And we found a list of 6 things. give up my prison income, give up communication with my family, move to another prison far away from my family, etc., and to die. And we thought, wow, it's very damaging. It's very threatening to ask someone in prison who is a terrorist if they will be willing to die for the group or for their religion. And we conducted one study to ask them, to what extent these things are extremes for you, are extreme. And we found that all of them are extreme. And to die for the group is in the middle. So we decided, okay, we are not going to include to die for the group in the main study. Because some participants, when you ask about this, they say, maybe I don't want to respond to this item. So we are going to use for the next study only the other 5 items, right? And then the main study. In the main study, we selected the group that I told you, and we had to drop some of the participants because they didn't want to respond or for other reasons, but we have a very good, decent sample. Also, something very important to take into account is that there is a group of jihadists, but the other participants are also, in particular, for example, the Latino gangs are really dangerous people, are not those who have entered into prison for a few months, because we want to label the kind of participants that we had in the different groups. And the method was a face-to-face interview. The first part of the interview was a narrative. We asked them, what do you do here in prison from the beginning of the day to the end of the day? And after that, talk to me about your life, all your life, in 10 minutes, because we had no more time. But just to know what they study, if they have a family, etc. But nothing related with the potential crime, because all of them are innocent. So obviously they are there, but it's wrong. And we use a questionnaire. For the questionnaire, we didn't use paper and pencil. We use a tablet because we have our own platform for data collection, where you can include the dynamic measures, not only the usual items, and obviously we don't have internet connection. But every day at the end of the day, when we finish the interviews, we can connect with the internet, and all the data was included in our server, right? So it was very hard working to analyze all the interviews, more than 500 hours, and we have to consider all what participants say to try to create different categories and to elaborate the variables that we were interested in. And we focus on those variables that could be related with our theory and that are related with the risk of radicalization. For example, those things that are related with fusion with a group or for the value. Also, the variables that we consider that could be risk factor or protective factors as perception of injustice, personal discrimination, fusion with the family and fusion with the justice system, because according to the literature and according to our experience, we thought that this could be a protective factor, and also sacrifices for group and value. And this is what we found. For example, just a few examples. If you are interested in what people say and you enter into our paper, there is a supplementary material information, and you can find all the comments of the participants in Spanish, right? We consider those statements that was in favor of, for example, perception of injustice and against. And our idea was to check whether, depending on the groups, the kind of expressions in the narrative was different. And this is what we found. In particular, jihadists are more fused with the value than Latino gangs. This is a comparison between jihadists and Latino gangs. But when the comparison is between jihadists and all the other participants, the result is exactly the same. Jihadists are also perceive more injustice than Latino gangs, and they perceive more personal discrimination. However, in the case of Latino gangs, they are more fused with the group than jihadists, and they are more willing to do sacrifices for the group than jihadists. This is what we found in the field when we did the study in Iraq. The idea was, this is the same that is going to happen with the questionnaire, and we asked for fusion with the group and for the value. But we asked for fusion in the past, in the present, and in the future. In the past was before entering into prison, in the present now, and in the future after leaving prison. In this way, we control for the time they spend in prison. Because the idea was to see whether they perceive the same degree of commitment with the group or with the value over time. Or, because they are in prison, this kind of feeling could change. And we found that in the case of fusion with the group, there is only one group, jihadists, that maintains the level of fusion. There is no difference in the past. But in the present, now they are more fused with the group than Latino gangs, for example. What happened with the value? With jihadists, the same. They maintain the same level of fusion with the value. However, the other groups reduce fusion with the value. In the case of jihadists and Muslims, is religion, and in the case of gangs, are the gun or the ban, right? So we have demonstrated that there is a difference in fusion, but there is a difference in the sacrifices that they will be willing to do for the group and for the value. We include the scale that we found in the preliminary study without the item of dying for the group. And we found what we expected, that jihadists are more willing to sacrifice for the group and for the value than the other groups. And also very important, they are more willing to sacrifice for religion than for Muslims. This is also what we expected, because it's what we found in the field. Now we have the same results with jihadists. And we also included scales with the idea of checking whether these variables in a model of mediation are really protective factor or risk factors. We found that jihadists perceive more injustice. Also here, when we use the questionnaire instead of the narrative, jihadists and Latino gangs perceive more personal discrimination, and jihadists show the greatest fusion with the family. And this is very interesting, because fusion with the family could be a protective factor. And one problem with jihadists is that most of them are really living out of Spain, so their family are far away from them. So it's something that should be necessary to take into account in the programs of treatment. And in general, all participants have a low fusion with the justice system, as we expected. So this is also a way of a validity of our measure. And here I am going to show a comparison between jihadists and Latino gangs. When the comparison is between jihadists and the other groups, the result is exactly the same. As we expected, jihadists perceive more injustice than Latino gangs. And injustice is related with sacrifices for value in prison, and this is mediated with fusion with the value. So the more injustice they perceive, the more they are fused with religion, and the more they will sacrifice for religion. This doesn't mean that they are more religious than controls, but their interpretation of their religion is different. However, there is also a protective factor, is fusion with nation justice system. When you talk to them, those who refer to the staff in a good way because they receive a good treatment, they have a different perception of prison. And this could be something that should be taken into account in the programs. So the main step is between the group and perception of injustice. So which variables could be mediating in this process? We found that personal discrimination is one of the mediator mechanisms. So although those perceive a high level of personal discrimination, jihadists perceive higher levels of personal discrimination than Latino gangs. However, fusion with the family is a protective factor. So if they could have more opportunity of meeting with the family or having opportunity to talk to the family, perhaps this could reduce personal discrimination and also the perception of injustice. So now here we have novel processes that are relevant for the theory, but also what is very important for us is it has implication for intervention programs or for instruments to assess the risk of radicalization. In fact, we already have a couple of papers about this, but I have no time to show everything, but this has been really useful. And also we have found psychological difference between the different groups. And this is extremely relevant because sometimes in the literature they try to think that all these groups are equal, and they are very different. However, to understand the differences between the group can help to really understand the other groups. And there is some kind of things that should be taken into account for dealing with terrorism, in particular with jihadist terrorism, because there is some kind of variable that distinguishes from other groups. For example, greater commitment to the sacred values, in particular with religion. Also, long-lasting commitment to their values. Fusion is usually irrevocable. Once someone is fused with a group, they usually maintain the degree of fusion over time. However, there is some strategies that could reduce the level of fusion or the consequences of fusion. So this is something that could be possible. And also the perception of hostility, discrimination, etc., that should be taken into account in the program of treatment. And just to finish, we did this study just before the COVID. After the COVID, we did a second wave, and we have more data, including some data related with your theory, Karen. But we have had no time of doing the analysis because we have just started an ERC grant, because the idea is try to use this methodology in different countries with people who are under risk of radicalization, terrorists, and former terrorists. Because a jihadist in Spain is not the same than a jihadist in Belgium, Indonesia, or Sri Lanka, because there is a lot of differences. However, if you have a methodology to try to understand the process, you can use what you learn from the different kind of programs of treatment. And also, I think that we are very fortunate because we have a very group of collaborators all around the world that can help us to understand how this process can be different in different countries. And this is all. Thanks.
Thank you, Angel. A brilliant presentation. Time for questions before going for lunch? Yes?
Thank you for that introduction. I was wondering if how many groups these groups perceive that they are out there can change how few they are. So, for example, I can imagine that jihadists, they perceive like an homogeneous output out there. While Latino gangs, maybe they perceive many groups out there, like they are the Nietas, they are the Militarios. How that affect this perception of fuse with their own group? If there are many groups out there, as opposed to just one big group that we can face, like anti-jihadists or like Catholics.
Yeah. Well, this is not an easy question. In the case of Latino gangs, it could be easier because, in fact, we ask them which is which is your enemy. But in the case of jihadists, in this study, not in the study that we finished a few months ago, we asked for Occident in general. And it was quite dangerous for us because when you ask about Occident, they didn't want to respond and they get angry. So it is clear that they have a common enemy, right? But you can't ask these kind of questions to them directly. It's what I said at the beginning of my talk, is that you can include some scales about radicalization in a questionnaire with terrorists. Here is the saying, you need to be very careful. For that reason, it's crucial to do preliminary studies, a few preliminary interviews, because think that the person that you are talking to could be someone from the, I can give you examples, but you can imagine, right? So you need to be very careful with what you are asking.
Yeah, over there, Carmen.
Muchas gracias. I was thinking that identifying yourself with a group is not necessarily a bad thing. How is it? I mean, we all identify with a group, and that's not necessarily bad. I mean, I can think of situations where you fuse with your family or whatever, and that might be detrimental. So what goes wrong for them to, because you are suggesting that the fusion is associated to the degree of dangerousness and the acts that they commit. So what's the problem?
Yeah, no, of course. I am sure that most of you are fused with your family, and you will die for your family, and this is not bad. And in the last few months, there is a paper in a very important journal about the positive side of identity fusion. It's like the same than religion, for example. There is no difference in religiosity between jihadists and non-jihadists. It's the way they interpret this kind of commitment. So here is the same. They are fused with the religion, and they think that there is a threat to their religion, and they need to do something in favor of religion. So it's this kind of interpretation. So being fused with a group or with another person doesn't mean that that this is a bad thing. It's the same that, for example, think on gender violence, for example. Think in someone who have killed his wife, maybe he was fused. But also someone who has a very romantic relation with his couple, maybe he's also fused. But it depends of other variables that could be moderating this effect. So it is true that usually people try to think that fusion is a negative thing, but fortunately there is a few papers now that show that there is a positive side. If you are fused with an NGO and you want to go to Africa to help people, you are fused and you can die. Or now, for example, think on people who go to Ukraine for helping them against Russia. They are fused with Ukraine or with liberty or with freedom, democracy, and they are perceiving that this is a good thing. Also depend on the perception that they have.
Veronica, and after Veronica, over there.
Angela, I have a very related question. So, have you measured integrative complexity, cognitive complexity? Because it seems to me that you cannot be fused with too many groups, because, I mean, after all, you're only one person, while you can be identified with multiple groups. So, is identity fusion, even for the ones who are working for the NGO, possibly positive for society, but not for them, because they're putting all their baskets of the self in one group.
Yeah.
So my question is for you, how much that fusion is driven by the inability to deal with the complexity of belonging to multiple groups at an emotional and cognitive level?
Yeah, I am very happy with your question because it's something that distinguishes fusions from identification. You can be identified with a lot of groups, but usually you are fused only with one group, one extended group, for example, the country, and one local group, for example, your friends. But these are very costly processes. You can be fused with anyone because it implies that you need to do a lot of things for that. So it's something that we already know. That is very. In fact, when you ask about fusion with different groups or with different values, only if the groups or the values are very related, they choose fusion. But if not, they are not fused with that. In the case, for example, of jihadists in this way, we didn't ask for fusion with the family. We asked for fusion with the father, the mother, the brothers and sisters. And this is very relevant because in the case of Latino gangs, for example, they are fused obviously with their mother as jihadists, with their brothers and sisters, but not with their father. Right? So what happened, and you know more than me about the cultural differences, depending on the culture, the family could be different for them. So sometimes you need to take into account this distinction. But you are right, it's a complex phenomenon and you can be fused with anything.
Over there, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Angeli. Thank you for a really, really good social psychology research, actually. I have two questions. First one is about the predictors. So you focus mostly on the sense of individual discrimination instead of collective discrimination. And also, and my question is why? Mm-hmm. And also, my question is whether you've studied meta-dehumanization.
Sorry, I can't hear you well.
No, only the last part of the question. The first part was clear.
If you studied meta-dehumanization, the perception,
Dehumanization.
Yes. And the second question is if you could talk a little bit about gender differences.
About gender difference. Okay, I have not a lot of time, but I can tell you that we measure dehumanization, and you can imagine we use the measure of the Darwin measure, and when you are going to talk with a Muslim, the first reaction is that, but you really believe on that? So, yeah, they don't believe on that. But they respond. We told them that this is like a metaphor, please try to respond, and they responded. Now we are using a different measure, like an implicit measure with different phases. We have to analyze this data. It seems that there is not a difference between dehumanization in different groups, but there is a difference between the relation that they have between dehumanization and other variables. But it's something that we need to study more. And I forgot the second question was?
Gender.
Yes. Yes, I have not a lot of time, but something that I can tell you is that when we ask female jihadists and controls about their fusion with the group and with the value, there is a big difference with jihadists. If you remember, in the case of jihadists, fusion was like this. In the case of jihadists, was like this, for females. Because they entered into jihad and they tried, in fact, some of them went to Syria, because they have a kind of disenchantment with their families, with the society, with their friends. However, when they arrived there, on their way, when they embraced the jihad, they found that it was not what they expected. So they suffered a double disenchantment, and then they diffuse with the group and with the value. So this is quite different, right? And this is very relevant because they are not as willing as males as fight and die for the group. They will do other kind of things. So it's, but it is curious that it's the first time that it has been conducted one research like this, taking into account female jihadists and non-jihadists, because in the case of controls Muslims, females, they maintain the level of fusion. They don't decrease fusion. However, they are not willing to be terrorists. So fusion can be related with negative things or positive things.
Hi. So even though jihadists maintain the same fusion with the values and groups, did they show any sign of individual guilt?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Even though jihadists maintain the same fusion with the values and groups, did they show any sign of individual guilt?
Sorry, if they have individual guilt, if they have guilt, individual guilt, although they are fused with the group, if they have some kind of individual guilt or feeling.
No, why? For someone being fused with a group is usually something positive. They don't need to feel any kind of guilt. Oh, you can ask these kind of things. Sometimes. It is true that in the second wave, last summer, while there was the problem with Afghanistan, we were traveling, collecting data, and sometimes the terrorists talking to us about what happened there. But it's usually they start to talk about this. You can't start this kind of conversation with them, because if not, the interview stops and they say, I don't want to respond anything more.
Okay, I think the last question over there.
Hi, from a social psychology perspective, every paper nowadays talks about situationism, like the importance of the situation, but it seems that only for the Latino gang group, the change in the situation affected them, but not for Muslims. Why would that be? Why do you think?
Because it's a different kind of commitment. Note, for example, that in the case of Latino gangs, they have a strong commitment with a local group, a gang. And when they, after leaving prison, maybe it's the only group that they have for protecting them. In the case of jihadists, their stronger commitment is with religion. Even it's stronger than the commitment with other Muslims, even with other terrorists, because the collective is not as important as the value. Then for that reason, it seems that the process is quite similar, but there is a lot of differences. And you need to take into account this for prevention and also for reintegration.
Okay, I think it's time to stop. We are already out of the schedule that we have. I hope to see you. Probably this is the National Intelligence Center. Listening the talk of Angel, so thank you all. I hope to see you after lunch at 3:30.